The advantage, I suppose, of growing older is that you really concentrate upon things. There are not so many distractions and so on. One's time is no longer divided with other things like teaching, for example. And so you can really concentrate your mind upon particular ways and methods of working that you never have really done before. You thought you had, but you realize when you get older and you're retired that you have, for the first time, really focused your attention on what you're doing. One realizes at this late stage of working that one is really a late developer, and that you really do need to live for a long time in order to fully realize the sort of ideas that you have. I think it started initially by seeing my great uncle carving stone, carving marble. He was an architectural mason, and I watched him carving capitals for a building, and watched him carving other details for memorial sculpture. This piece is called Reliquary Triptych. It is a kind of apostle or winged figure like an angel. You can pick out suggestive elements of the figure in it, of course. Well, the heart, for example, breasts, if you like, kidneys, pelvis. It is suggesting that the figure contains things in the sense that a reliquary contains religious forms like the bones of a saint. This business of a container, this business of compacting things can start right back with the womb, if you like, but it certainly is something which applies throughout life, that we live in containers of every kind and travel in containers and end up in containers, that it's all one kind of continuous thing. And I relate it to the business of security, this business of bringing things together. And in this case, it relates back to what I said about this business of bringing experiences together, containing them and delivering them together. It's a form, as a novel is a form. A piece of music is a form. And it's a container too, isn't it, in a way? I also have a yen for exotic materials, like the exotic woods from various parts of the East and the Western world. I have to admit that I like to bring to it a certain age, a certain almost antique quality about it. I have a sort of forgery element in me that wants to make things that have the characteristics and qualities of the things that I find in Europe and England and in museums and so on. This particular one is called Hotel Grand Illusion, and it is one of the kind of storytelling architectural pieces. The symbol of the rainbow is a thing which has occurred in quite a number of the pieces that I've done. It is something which is a little more than Judy Garland's version as far as I'm concerned. It's a symbol which is kind of important to the notion of hope. The application of paint to the wood I try to use in a way that relates closely to the colour of the wood, not make too big a jump. I usually use just thin acrylic colour so that the underlying colour shows through to some extent, and it so marries itself with the material that it's painted upon. My first experience of Italy was as a POW, of course, and so I didn't see a very great deal, but I saw quite a lot of the architecture and the spirit of the thing. And the curious thing is that I painted the first Madonnas whilst I was in Italy, that although I was not in a position to see very much, the influence already began, so that when I went back afterwards, as I've done many, many times since, it's become a stronger and stronger kind of force. All sorts of things in other parts of Europe have had a very marked effect, but nowhere do I feel so much to belong visually, if not linguistically, unfortunately, to Italy, to the Italian landscape, to Italian architecture, to the great tradition of the Renaissance age. But in that I include, of course, the Romanesque, the Italian Gothic. I don't just mean the High Renaissance. The title of this piece is The Burden of Dreams, which is taken from the title of a novel, but it's the burden of my dreams. It's the record of the kind of recurring dream from Germany in 1944-45, when there was lots of experience of buildings slashed in half. The doll's face is a photographic collage which has painting upon it too, but it is put in there on a huge kind of scale, like a black projection screen, to really intensify the horror. The kind of element in my work which is really of a memorial nature goes back before World War II. Certainly that's had a very, very marked and strong influence. It's not a kind of experience that anyone can possibly forget. But again, going back to the Egyptian galleries, going back to some of the early civilizations, you get this obsession with the business of death and the business of memorials. The Etruscans, for example, in Italy, you see, are a great favorite of mine in these respects. But it is this kind of notion of putting things together, of burying things, of making, in a way, memorial pieces that are containers of ideas, containers of experiences that bring together elements that don't make a clear statement of a story, but provide the kind of structure for one, so the viewer can make up their own story, can relate it to their own experience. It's this kind of factor. It's a sort of visual poetry, I hope. The subject of still life and food has fascinated me from being quite a young child, really, of going to the Harvest Festival at the chapel that we used to attend. And the arrangement of all these things were factors that I used to think were really very beautiful in the very austere and sort of emptiness of a English chapel. This kind of thing I found the equivalent of in the art of pagan peoples, this business of the gift of fruit, this business of, again, leaving it as food in burial chambers, for example, and so on, you say. But to quite an extent in recent years, it's been my interest in the paintings of Mantegna, of Carlo Cruelli, of Vivarini, and so on, that all use this kind of fruit in the painting, and these three-dimensionals that I've done really equate with that kind of thing, but they are sort of gifts. Since I became so occupied with three-dimensional work, my painting has tended to be perhaps rather more channeled, more directed. A greater part of it has been to landscape, of course. The business of the structuring of space in landscape, so far as I'm concerned, relates very closely to the kind of symbols of space, the kind of different ways of thinking about space that obtain in the three-dimensional cabinets that I make. The business of skill has been rather a dirty word, like academic drawing in recent decades, which to me is a sad mistake. The danger of craftsmanship is when it becomes purely a repetitive skill, when it becomes the equivalent of how nicely you can draw, how precise and polished it can be, you see. But that's a purely dead occupation. But the business of turning wood, the business of carving wood, the business of routing wood is something that you can do in an imaginative and inventive kind of way. the kind of work that I do, I think, and which I've done for a long time, I think naturally leads one towards the business of accumulation of things that relate to one's experience, interests, and focus. This bringing of things together that have to live together whether they like it or not, which is, you know, an important kind of characteristic of my work. It's and of my way of living. The Victorian Albert Museum was paradise so far as I was concerned. You see, it was as a student that was the great discovery. On one cabinet, I put in a little bit that said, there are so many songs in me that won't be sung. And really, I don't think that it ever does end. I think that it can go on. I think it's changed an awful lot in the last 4 years. And I think it can go on changing, assuming that I can continue to work.